Okay, so this is a meeting to discuss Valero's CSI volume snapshot integration. It is Wednesday, December 4th, 2019. I'm Nolan Brubaker, and just going to go over what this slide deck is and kind of what the discussion is. This is meant to be a summary of a GitHub PR that's been open for a few months now. This is being recorded and it'll be available for review. The PR link is here. It's number 1661. There's code for a proof of concept that Steve, Chris, and I worked on to do these plugins, and I'm going to give some background on how those work. And I also have a place for collaborative notes. But the main agenda is going to be giving some background just so we all have kind of some common terms. So we have a common definition of things, and then to discuss where the current code is at and what our next steps are for getting Valero to support volume snapshots, or CSI volume snapshots specifically. So first, we're going to go over the background of kind of Valero and CSI, how Valero works, and then CSI volume snapshots. Then we're going to go into the current plugin implementation, then the challenges around that implementation, and then our next steps and any discussion in Q&A. So to jump in, just going to try to go through this kind of quickly. I'm not going to go super deep. So we're going to go into Valero plugins and the CSI data types. And to do that, I'm going to be kind of clear on what we're talking about with snapshots. So when we're talking about snapshots here, we're talking about things that are like standalone, that are replicated within a system like a cloud provider. So they're not directly tied to a volume, and they're not incremental. So they're more like an EBS or GCP snapshot. They're not like a snapshot we're not thinking about them like a snapshot you might take in a more traditional system. And they're not necessarily compatible across storage systems. Okay, so if you're familiar with Valero, we have these plugins that do the volume snapshot for you. They call the volume provider's API directly, and Valero was originally called EBS Snapshotter. Existed before CSI was a thing, and Valero was meant for the whole time to snapshot volumes. It's specific to Valero's implementation, and the output of these plugins is very similar to what the CSI volume snapshot API does. It creates a snapshot on the backup side, and it creates a persistent volume at the end of restore. And uses the volume snapshot location object to define information like regions and zones. It doesn't necessarily rely on cloud metadata or anything like that, metadata services. Valero also has item action plugins, and these are plugins that Valero uses on Kubernetes resources as they're getting backed up or restored. So like as a backup is processing, Valero will say, hey, does this resource get match these plugins? And if so, then it will run the execute method. So this is used for like taking a pod and backing up any relevant persistent volume claims. And then from those persistent volume claims, it would back up relevant persistent volumes. Moving on to CSI, going to find what I'm going to call CSI common controllers. So these are controllers that run in the cluster that kind of reconcile state for the CRDs that I'm going to talk about. And These are maintained by the community. They're not specific to a vendor. The vendor stuff are like the Amazon or Rook or Ceph, OpenEBS, those kinds of implementations. So these would be the external snapshotter, the external provisioner, external attacher, those kinds of things. So then the actual CRDs are the CSI volume snapshot, which exists in a namespace. And that represents a request to snapshot a persistent volume claim in the same namespace. There's the volume snapshot contents, which is cluster scopes. It's not in a namespace. Represents the on-disk contents of the snapshot, and it points to that on-disk snapshot and has a two-way link to the volume snapshot. So think of it like a PVC points to a PV. The volume snapshot content is the PV in that kind of comparison. Then there's the volume snapshot class, which is kind of, if we're using that comparison to the existing storage types, this is like a storage class. It defines parameters around how those snapshots are treated, and those will be vendor specific. The big ones that aren't vendor specific are the retention policies, which would be retaining the snapshots beyond the life of the CRDs or deleting them when the CRDs are deleted. And then finally, with the addition of the CRDs, persistent volume claims have a new field, data source, which means that you can create a new persistent volume from a volume snapshot using this data source. And just to illustrate how all the new CRDs relate, got a volume snapshot that has a bidirectional relationship with the volume snapshot content, and they both point to the volume snapshot class. And then if we look at how Valero's proof of concept works, we've implemented it as a set of 4 plugins. On the backup side, Valero actually just has one that processes persistent volume claims. And then we have a set of 3 plugins that act on the different objects when they come into the cluster. And then for convenience, we put them all in, we register them all in one binary. For illustration purposes, these solid lines are going to be a data relationship, and this dashed line is going to be code. So if we look at our cluster, the PVC is pointing to a PV, which points to a volume on disk. And the Velero CSI plugin applies to PVCs. And it's going to create a volume snapshot CRD based on the PVC. And from there, the CSI controllers are actually going to create the volume snapshot content. So all the Valero backup does is creates that volume snapshot content. Volume snapshot. So on the backup side, Valero actually doesn't do a whole lot. It creates the CRD and kind of moves on. And then inside the backup, you've got all these objects pointing to each other, and they point out to the snapshot on disk. And then for the restore, the volume snapshot restore item action plugin, all it really does is it breaks the binding to the original PVC so that the CSI controllers will know that it's a quote unquote import case. So you'll see up here, it was the PVC, the volume snapshot should have been pointing up to the PVC. Did these slides last night in a hurry. So instead of the relationship that we saw in that first slide, we're now down to just these objects pointing to each other. The volume snapshot content object, restore item action plugin, will update the bidirectional relationship between these volume snapshot and volume snapshot content objects so that the newly restored objects in the cluster are the actual objects, because the UUID changes when we do a restore. And then the persistent volume claim restore item action updates the data source field so that a new PVC will be pointing to the volume snapshot and can make a new volume from the snapshot. So then when the restore happens, we get a new volume that came from the snapshot. And now, sorry that I flew through all of that. Mostly I wanted to move on to these challenges, and we can go back if people have questions. But the current questions that we have, so if people have been attending some of our other meetings, one of the questions we've had has been for us, the Valero maintainers, has been, is the item action plugin format the right format for us to use? The prototype was a set of item action plugins because it seemed like the path of least resistance. The volume snapshotter approach was tried by a few people, but there's a bunch of pretty much irrelevant parameters on that. And doing restores actually competes with how the CSI common controllers work. So we're not sure that that's a great path to take. And also long-term, I'm not sure that that's a useful way to go, because assuming CSI volume snapshotting becomes the way to go, and as it matures, it grows more methods for more complex scenarios, the Valero volume snapshotter API is probably not going to keep up. So I'm looking for thoughts on that. And this may be more pointed at the core Valero team because it affects our maintenance and maybe other plugin authors as well. Does it make sense to keep it as an item action, or yeah, looking for input there. So I'll mute now and let others speak up.
I have a question. You say not volume snapshotter. In this case, do you mean you will implement a CSI plugin inside Valero instead of using the existing CSI plugins like the EBS plugin?
So actually our intent, so our intent is to go from this list. So we have, for example, there's this Valero plugin for AWS. And this Valero plugin for AWS will call the AWS API for doing snapshots. And that overlaps with AWS's own driver at this point. Ideally, long-term, we would like to retire this, this API. But for the short term, it might make sense for Valero to say the CSI drivers fit into a volume snapshotter plugin. But I don't know. So we want to use the CSI drivers. I think that's the kind of the actual goal. I think the question is, do we make it fit into a Valero Snapshotter plugin that then does basically the same work as what I outlined up here of making the volume snapshot that gets submitted to the API server?
Okay, I see. Okay, so if you go that route, looks like you will have to maintain a lot of plugins yourself instead of just using whatever is already available in CSI, right? So if you have to replace all of this, and then for any new ones, you will have to add another one here.
Right.
Right.
Right. So I guess the goal. So this list, we know this actual list is longer. We're actually, we would like this list to kind of condense down to just this one. So that Valero plugin for CSI is just kind of any volume that is CSI supported. This one would work for, I guess, is the end goal.
Okay.
Then the question is, does this Valero plugin for CSI work as Valero backup item actions or a Valero volume snapshotter? So this question is probably like Valero specific. It's an internal implementation detail. And maybe we even something we on the Valero team had asked even was maybe we even treat it specially and put it in core. I don't know that we'll do that immediately, but it's certainly an option.
So yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I've had a chance to think through kind of the different ways that we could package this. I think where I'm landing is that it probably doesn't make sense to try and put it into the volume snapshotter interface for a few different reasons. I mean, there is kind of a logical mismatch in terms of how CSI snapshots work compared to how our existing volume snapshotter interface works, particularly on the restore side. That would just make it difficult to actually combine them into a single operating model. But I think also, our long-term vision for this is that as CSI becomes prevalent and everyone who's using Kubernetes and storage in Kubernetes is using CSI, Valero's volume snapshotter plugins essentially become irrelevant. And at some point we'll completely remove them from the project. And so given that, it seems kind of funny to, be trying to get CSI to fit into an interface that long-term we're planning to remove from our project anyway. And it's, at that point when CSI really has taken over and everyone's going through it, there's not really a need for storage plugins to Valero because, everything is just going to be going through a CSI plugin.
Yeah.
And then, so if we assume we're not doing it through a volume snapshotter plugin, then we can kind of either take the path of implementing it as item action plugins, or we can hard code a bunch of logic in Valero. And I do think there that using the item action plugins makes sense. Part of the intent of having those item actions was to be able to kind of encapsulate the custom logic for different resources into their own little snippets of code, essentially, so that it's not all just munged together in the main, backup and restore code within Valero.
Right.
So I think, packaging each of those bits of logic for the different resource types up into their own item actions makes sense. It kind of fits the model that we want to go with.
Right. Even
if those plugins are, kind of internal plugins or plugins that exist within the core Valero repository, I still think from an organization perspective, it makes sense.
Okay. And I think for the time being then, and unless anyone has any immediate objections just for the sake of moving this along and for the beta, we can keep this like in their own, in this repo, the Valero plugin for CSI repo. And like you said, we do have in the Valero code base, we have code implemented as these item actions so that they're logically separated, not baked into the core path. And once CSI volume snapshots themselves get promoted to GA and the Valero support gets promoted, then we can maybe start thinking about, does it make sense to promote this in tree? Okay, so I think for now, if we can revisit this in the PR, but I think for now I'm going to say we keep the item actions and move on to the next bullet.
I would. Oh, go ahead, Adnan.
Is the plan to eventually have the RESTIC integration also be a plugin? I know we kind of talked about bringing that into a plugin to kind of make it more consistent with everything else as well. So if that's the case, then we only have a single code path, which is everything is through a plugin.
I would defer to Steve on that.
Yeah, I mean that could probably be its own whole hour discussion, but I mean what we've talked about is, you know, the potential of implementing RESTIC functionality as a volume snapshotter plugin, which I think there are some advantages to, because RESTIC right now is its own code path, and so you know, it's a separate set of stuff to maintain. But if we decide to make RESTIC a volume snapshotter, at some point down the road, we're going to have the situation where we're ready to deprecate volume snapshotters because everything else has moved over to CSI, except we'll then potentially still have this one kind of special volume snapshotter for RESTIC. So I'm sort of still undecided on that. I'm not necessarily sure that it makes sense long term, but you know, there's also a possibility that way down the road, if CSI, you know, provides snapshotting functionality for enough providers that RESTIC goes away as well. So
there's also the potential that we or someone else writes a CSI provider that is just RESTIC wrapping. I don't know. Honestly, I have no idea how that would work. So, but it's, I suppose, possible. But yeah, that's certainly worth thinking about. But I also think Steve's right that that's something RESTIC could probably be many hours worth of discussion in itself. So certainly worth thinking about. But I think I'll move to the next one if that's all right.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the packaging discussion for a second. I think, in my mind, I think we should plan to move these CSI item action plugins into Valero Core, at least for GA.
Yep, makes sense to me.
I don't see any reason why we can't keep them in their own repository for now, given that this is going to be behind a feature flag and essentially a beta feature. But I do think eventually we'll want to do that just because they will be there'll be core functionality. There'll be other code in Valero that will assume that these plugins exist, and it'll just make things simpler for packaging and deployment.
Yep. My current thinking is anything that would be in core Valero would be behind a feature flag, and if there's nothing, then we don't have to introduce a feature flag. You just install the plugin knowing it's beta. But I was going to include that in next steps.
Sounds good.
Okay. So the next one. So this one came up. This is a question that is kind of goes to Valero's operating model. So Valero, for its own quote unquote native snapshots, it keeps a list of the snapshot, what CSI calls snapshot handles, in a JSON file in object storage. So it does track volume snapshots, but it doesn't put them in Kubernetes. It puts them in a list in object store. So it's not putting them in the backup tarball. However, with CSI, the volume snapshots are namespaced as objects in Kubernetes. So Valero will include them in the backup. When we do that, let's say we take a backup on Monday. That includes snapshots. Then Tuesday, we take a backup, and it includes snapshots of the same namespace. That now includes the volume snapshot for Monday. If you delete Monday's backup, the volume snapshot, assuming you have retention policy as delete, Monday's snapshot will be gone, but Tuesday's backup includes all of those resources because Valero doesn't go in and garbage collect inside those tarballs. So this is going to be something we're going to have to, consider. This may be fixed on an import case. So when you restore from that Tuesday backup, it's going to create a volume snapshot content and a volume snapshot object, but they'll be pointing to a volume snapshot, a snapshot handle on disk that doesn't exist. And I don't know exactly what will happen there. Jing, I don't know if you can clarify what will occur there. Will those just sit there not able to be used?
I don't think I get this completely. So basically, this is when you are creating a volume file snapshot, right? So this is static binding. Okay.
Yeah. So in the CSI terms, it's static binding, but so to put it in CSI terms, I'm creating a volume snapshot content and a volume snapshot, but the snapshot handle is pointing to is invalid.
Invalid.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So for the beta code, this actually depends on whether the CSI driver implements list snapshots.
Okay.
If it didn't implement that, we just assume it is valid. So it's going to treat it as a valid snapshot. But if they implemented that, we're going to check if it really exists or not.
Okay.
In the case where list snapshots is implemented, then what happens if that snapshot handle is not actually found? How is that reflected in the resources?
That's going to fail, right? It doesn't exist. It's going to result in an error when you're trying to import that.
Does it set a field on the status of one of the custom resources, or?
Yeah. So yeah, you will see that failure. Yeah. So we do have status in volume snapshot and also in the content. Both has status now in the new beta API.
Okay. So that to me actually sounds kind of acceptable. The case where list snapshots isn't implemented is then not great.
Then we just assume that's correct because that's the behavior. That's how PVPVC static binding works.
Gotcha.
Because we don't have a way to verify.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense because if you can't verify it, there's just nothing you can do.
Yeah.
And then when somebody goes to use it, then they'll get errors because.
Right. It doesn't exist. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, that answers the question at least, like what will happen. And with the beta, that's better than where it was in the alpha because the alpha had no status.
Yeah, in the content, yeah.
Okay, that answers my question. So the next ones, these were all for Steve, so I'm going to hand those over to him.
Yeah, sorry, I just dumped a whole bunch of words here so I can try and summarize the questions a little bit. The first one, so I'm just thinking through how CSI snapshots will interact with Valero's pre and post hooks. And so as a quick summary for how this works today, Valero lets you configure pre or post hooks, which are commands that are run within a pod before or after backing up that pod. So typically, if you have a pod that's using a PVC, what you can do is on that pod, you configure a pre-hook to quiesce your application. Then as part of the pod being backed up, the PVC that it's using is also backed up. So you can essentially get a snapshot while the pod is being backed up. And then after the pod is finished being backed up, the post hook will be run. So you can there unquiesce the application. And so I think this basic model still holds with CSI snapshots, because essentially when we go to back up the PVC that a pod is using, that'll trigger the CSI backup item action for PVCs, and that will actually create the CSI volume snapshot custom resource. So then the main question I had there is kind of, when will our backup item action plugin exit? So are we thinking that we'll basically wait until we get a snapshot handle within that volume snapshot? Or are we thinking about waiting until it's ready to use, which I think there are potentially some issues with, but I wasn't exactly sure I don't even remember what we're doing in the prototype or what we were thinking, Nolan.
Yeah, so we discussed this a little bit in a thread on Slack, and so the way Valero currently works, we just proceed as soon as we get the snapshot handle. And I had played with, I think the POC as it stands on GitHub just proceeds as soon as the volume snapshot is created. The problem with waiting for ready to use is that the quiescing could be a long time, especially depending on the provider. If we wait until we have if we only wait until we have a handle, then that's roughly equivalent to how Valero currently works. I'm also wondering if it makes sense to not back up the volume snapshot CRD itself into the tarball until it's ready to use. Because I don't know that we want to put it in the backup tarball until it's ready to use true, because that seems strange. I know that's not exactly what you're asking, but I think that this might require some more experimentation because honestly, with the POC, I didn't set up a ton of hooks. So I think before we do a whole lot more, like I think the order of operations here will be moving our code to the beta and then testing that with the hooks and doing experiments with the various states, because each of the plugins, like with the slides, the most complicated plugin is the backup one. And I don't think, off the top of my head, I didn't look at that one, but I don't think it reaches into the volume snapshot content right now. If it does, it just like sets an annotation for the backup it's associated with.
Yeah. So go ahead.
For the quiesce, yeah, we shouldn't be waiting longer than, I think that's the reason we have this ready to use flag. You want to resume the application as soon as the snapshot is cut.
Right.
You don't want to quiesce for longer period of time.
So are you thinking that as soon as, Jing, if I understand correctly, when ready to use is set to false, that means, is it safe to assume that we have a snapshot handle? Yeah,
you should be able to basically create snapshot will return first, and then we're going to, this is dynamic case, or this period is dynamic case. Yeah, so create snapshot will be called multiple times. The first time we should get a handle, and then we're going to call that again to check the status until it is ready. But as soon as it returns, you should get a handle, and at that time you should be able to resume your application.
Okay. So from Valero's perspective, so Valero would be operating on it from just observing the Kubernetes API. So from Valero's perspective, it would be observing that the volume snapshot content has a snapshot handle populated.
Right.
And then it could move on. Yeah. And then
not just the head, not just the kind of, but you need to get the snapshot handle. Just check if you have that handle, because
right, but that's only on the snapshot content, right?
Yes.
Yeah, if we're only using the Kubernetes API, like we're not directly on the gRPC.
So, okay, you could check. I think you can check the creation time. If creation time is set, then that means it's created. It's cut.
Oh, on the snapshot handle?
Volume
or on the volume snapshot?
Volume snapshot status has a creation time. Yeah.
Oh, okay. On the status. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, then I think that's basically how we're working now.
Okay.
So we just have to wait till that field is set.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's what I thought was the case. But I mean, if we check the volume snapshot content for the snapshot handle, that's like a way to be super extra sure.
Right.
But yeah, it sounds like we don't want to wait for ready to use true unless we're doing like a restore immediately.
Yes.
For whatever reason. But on the restore side, when we're doing the static provisioning, like if we're reassembling all the pieces, the ready to use, the controllers should update ready to use to true, because we're going to be resetting the status and everything when we put all the pieces back together. So actually, now that I think about it, that status probably doesn't matter as much.
I mean,
but you need it at restore time. You need to check it, right?
Right, but it should be that status should be updated when we. So at restore time, Valero takes all the backed up resources. So let's say we're rebuilding a cluster in a new Kubernetes cluster in the same availability zone. We'll put the Kubernetes manifests in. So in this case, Valero's calling it a restore, but CSI would call it a static provisioning or a static binding. So Valero would be basically deleting the status fields. But the CSI controller, the common controllers would basically be setting these fields to ready to use true for us, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Assuming everything went right, everything went well.
Yeah, if list snapshots is implemented, otherwise we'll just set it to ready to use right away.
Oh, okay, sure. Okay, so depending on the driver.
Yeah.
But that would be the case in the dynamic side anyway, right? Like.
No, during static binding, we're going to call list snapshots to find out the status.
Oh, okay.
List snapshots in the beta API, list snapshots is only called for the static binding.
I see. Okay, so I might need to go read some more of the. I know I signed up for writing more of the tests, so I need to dig into that code base some more and start writing the tests. That may help answer some of these questions. But I think
ping me when you're ready, because there's another person also working on tests. Just want to make sure that you guys don't work on the same thing.
Sure. Yep. But Steve, does that answer your first question? I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And just one other thing on that, which is that, so Valero already for its existing snapshots has the limitation where it doesn't model waiting for the snapshot to be ready.
Right.
So if you go to do a restore of a backup and the snapshot hasn't actually completed replicating, you won't be able to restore it. This is the issue Scott ran into. So
Right.
I think long-term, like we want to model that probably both for our existing plugins as well as for CSI. And with CSI, it's by using the ready to use field.
Right.
But
CSI
I'd be,
has the data, but Valero plugins don't.
right. So we'd need Valero to observe this field to know when the backup is actually ready to be restored. So I'd be okay kind of tackling that separately and not making it part of the MVP for backup and restore here.
Right. It sounds to me like this is basically already, like we're already on the same, like the implementations are pretty much equal.
Right. Yeah.
To your next question, so you're asking about volume snapshot locations, which in Valero, this defines things like availability zone, region, basically any settings we would hand off to the storage provider. Valero needed that because Valero isn't deeply integrated with the storage vendor implementation. And am I representing that question correctly?
Yeah, I mean, there were various settings that we stored in here, basically any opaque parameters for our plugins.
Right.
But I think they're not relevant when we're using CSI, right? Like basically you'll have a volume snapshot class, which essentially takes the place of this. And so as a Valero user, you set up your volume snapshot class in your cluster. You make sure that your provider's CSI plugin is installed, and then you don't have to define a volume snapshot location in Valero to be able to get snapshots.
Yes, from what I can.
So in the volume snapshot class actually does not have the defined topology thing like in the storage class, but you can do that. Driver maintainer can do that themselves. That should be fine. Yeah, it's opaque, then you can do that.
Yeah, so I was going to say I was looking at the AWS implementation today to see if I could answer this, and the settings don't map directly. So the volume, like it's not a one-to-one mapping of, yeah, all the settings that were in the Valero volume snapshot locations go directly into the volume snapshot class. But I think depending on your vendor, you may have less configuration to do. So if you're on AWS, for example, and you're using the CSI driver, because the CSI driver is now more like it's your entire storage solution, it knows more about your topology and you don't have to do anything. Specifically for AWS, they're using their metadata servers, and it's getting the region and zone, all that information dynamically. So I think the answer is kinda. So yes, the volume snapshot locations are not needed when using CSI, but no, they're not directly replaced by volume snapshot class. That's probably different settings in this case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, if you take Azure as an example, like, in Valero today, you can define a volume snapshot location for Azure, and one of the configuration options there is the resource group to put the snapshots into, which doesn't have to be the same resource group as where your cluster is or where your volumes are. And so I would think that with CSI, the Azure CSI plugin could expose the option to define a resource group as a config parameter on the volume snapshot class. I don't know if it does or not, but
right.
Theoretically it could. But that's like for CSI snapshots through Valero, that's where we should be directing folks for any configuration for their provider.
Exactly.
Because we wouldn't have any way to pass it into CSI anyway, even if you did define a volume snapshot location.
Right. It's going to end up being either a volume snapshot class or the storage class or whatever, wherever they end up, the storage provider ends up defining that parameter. Like the topologies, looking at the Amazon one, I think it's going to end up where they put volumes. Like, I don't know exactly how the implementations will work, but I think they're going to end up like going to the node where the volume is in some cases. But yeah, that and you actually bring up a good point there. Like in Azure, we can do stuff like send to a different resource group. I don't know if they'll allow that in their implementation. And if they don't, that may be a place we'll have to help them with, because I know people like that.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just having a quick look at the Azure Disk CSI driver, and they only have one entry for resource group in the config, and there doesn't seem to be a way to specify one specifically for snapshotting. So,
well, it's also early days, but that's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly raise, for like each of the providers that we have, we could raise the configuration, basically tell the maintainers of each of these providers, like, here are the configuration options that we've had users ask for and that we've implemented. And so, these potentially could be good things to add to the CSI drivers.
Yep.
That's a great idea.
Anyway, the main reason I raise this is because it means a different UX depending on whether you're using CSI snapshots or not, and it means different documentation. So we're just gonna have to keep that in mind as we go through this. Is like we're gonna need to fork the documentation depending on whether you're using CSI or not for snapshots.
Yes, there is going to be a transition period that's going to be painful. Okay, so how do we think about backing up the existing? So this is existing volume snapshots and volume snapshot contents in the cluster. So stuff not created by Valero.
Yeah, it's sort of an extension of the thing we were talking about on the previous slide. Like there are existing ones that were created by previous Valero backups, but there are also existing ones that were created completely outside of Valero.
Right.
I'm just trying to think through, like, does it make sense to back these things up? Because you certainly have the same scenario where when you go to restore them, potentially the actual snapshot itself has actually been deleted, no longer exists. But Valero doesn't really have any way to know about that.
I think part of the proposal of CSI volume snapshotting is that we have a common base. And I think it would make sense to have to kind of, it would make sense to have a way for Valero to adopt them. But I don't know what that looks like, because I haven't given it a ton of thought. I think it's something Adnan and I mentioned in our talk at KubeCon, because I think it makes sense to make Valero be like a good citizen in the community, to be like, hey, you played around with CSI snapshots, here, let Valero grab them. But I think that may end up being like some sort of extra tool in Valero to be like, Valero CSI adopt, and he goes and scans for volume snapshots. And but I that may be its own, maybe its own design doc, honestly.
But so, I mean, there's the scenario now where, say, a user creates a CSI volume snapshot in their namespace for whatever reason. And then subsequently they take a Valero backup of that namespace. That volume snapshot YAML will be included in the Valero tarball because it's just a resource within that namespace that's being backed up.
Right.
It's not a special volume snapshot. It's not one that was triggered by Valero for the purposes of backing up a PVC. It's just another Kubernetes resource that happens to exist in the namespace. So I think it's probably fine to back it up. There's no harm in storing the YAML for it in our tarball. But when you go to restore it, if the underlying snapshot no longer exists, then when we restore that particular volume snapshot YAML, it'll be lost or failed or whatever the status is.
That's true. It'll be treated the same way as if it was a Valero backed up one and it got deleted.
Yeah.
I didn't do bookkeeping on it.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say, even if the snapshot was retained, it should be treated the same, unless we do more granular applies to in the restore plugins to say like it only applies to stuff that has a Valero backup label or as an
Right.
indentation.
Yeah, I mean, the main difference would be that we wouldn't be using it as a data source for a PVC that we're restoring.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So we wouldn't necessarily wire it up. That's true.
We just recreate the volume snapshot itself in the cluster.
That's true. Yeah. So we would recreate it and we wouldn't necessarily. So if somebody wanted to go make a PVC with it, they could. But Valero wouldn't do it for them automatically.
Right.
I think in my mind, okay, like in my mind, that seems acceptable. It may be surprising, but like,
Well, it's almost not surprising, right? Because in a way, it's just doing what Valero does to every other API
right?
group.
Yeah, yeah. It's a balance. Like on the one hand, like putting on my Valero developer hat, it's not surprising. It's just a thing in the API. Based on user questions I've seen and people just thinking about, they're like, well, it's a CSI snapshot. Of course, Valero has CSI support. I could see somebody being like, well, why didn't it hook everything up? Yeah, I kind of think like for the beta, I'm fine with that. And then maybe iterating on it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I do agree, like from the Valero perspective, it makes sense to just back it up and restore it.
Yeah,
it's just, it's kind of a weird case because it's like a backup of a backup almost.
Yeah, no, including these from Valero, including these things in the Valero backup does get weird. I agree. So that's maybe something we can pull apart as we go, but I think for now, I don't think we have to solve everything, but there's certainly there was big questions I would like to, at least if we put them in front of ourselves and think about. And I actually have a hard stop on the hour. So for the next one,
it's probably one we don't need to discuss in detail. It's more of a detail of whether we back up PVs when we're taking CSI snapshots, but I think we can discuss it offline if you want.
Okay. Yeah. If you want to put it on the GitHub issue, we can discuss there too.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So for the next steps, I think the next thing to happen will be for us to update our CSI plugins to use the beta CRDs and code, so that we're kind of current with the upstream. I also would like to help the CSI team get their controllers and code moved forward, and get help them move along to get to GA status, so that more of the Kubernetes community can get onto CSI. I think Steve, you added we need to get the Valero design doc merged. My hope is we can get it merged, even if there's some outstanding questions. I don't think we need to block on every question, but make sure there's nothing huge. We need to make sure if there's any big breaking changes under Valero itself, since we're planning, I think, to get some of this work into 1.3 to start rolling this out. Any big breaking things will go under a feature flag, if we want any core support. And then kind of the logistical steps is breaking this into logical issues for execution. And I've got some of that started, and I need to revisit some of that. So I've got some of this. I think we're going to move forward with the item actions plugins, and we'll keep that external for moving that forward into beta. And then for GA, which I expect to be after volume snapshots become GA for Kubernetes, we'll look at moving it in tree. And is there anything else anyone would like to add?
No, I think we should be close on the design doc. We'll just make sure that anything, you know, that came up from this discussion is reflected there. Make sure that any outstanding questions on the doc itself are resolved, but I think we should be about ready to get it in.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Once I get the link to the recording, I will send that out to the Google group. And I hope we can do more of these open design discussions, Rustic, and any other larger topics. Sorry for the short notice on this one. Hopefully we have a little bit more lead time on ones in the future. But yeah, have a great week. Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'd love to, you know, since this is a pretty big new feature, I'd love to spend some time covering just general updates on it, kind of on each weekly community meeting.
Yeah,
so that,
for sure.
You know, everyone's kind of kept in the loop on what's happening as we go, because this is a, you know, it's a big, exciting new feature.
Yeah, absolutely. So plan to keep that rolling and keep people up to date. And I know this is also something that is going to evolve outside of Valero. So it's not just something we're doing. Like at Jing, also thank you to Jing, who's on the call, because she's pushed a lot of this upstream. There really wouldn't be volume snapshots without her efforts. So thank you. And thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you very much for doing this. Appreciate it.
Yep. Yeah,
Thank
no problem.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.